Hello, everyone. I apologize once again for the audio only lecture here. I'm still having trouble with my eyes. I'm hoping by the end of next week that will no longer be a problem. So let's keep our fingers crossed. I was told that you all never received the first lecture that I did with audio only. And I kept referencing it in my last audio lecture. So you were all probably confused since you didn't have that first lecture. So I thought I'd just be able to go and put it right back up. But unfortunately, that file is gone. A lot of times when I record an audio file, I just put it up and I delete it from my computer because I assume that YouTube is storing it the way that I want it to. And unfortunately, that did not happen. So we're going to go back and do that now. I will try to keep it short and to the point. The first thing that I did in that video or that audio file was I talked to you about what assignments were forthcoming. So I'm going to talk about that again. You might have seen them appear on your Blackboard site, and hopefully that gives you some idea of what's forthcoming, but I wanted to talk you through it. So, of course, we only have one more exam, and that's going to be at the end of the semester. And no, it's not necessarily comprehensive, although I feel like you need to sort of build up your political knowledge as you go along through the semester. I'm learning as we go as well, because these are unique times, as we say, in political communication, which is both exciting and a little bit stressful, to be honest with you. So one of the things I'm going to have you do is I'm going to have you answer a question in short essay form. And when I say short essay, I'm talking like maybe 3 pages here, nothing too extensive. I would like you to have some outside references. They can be from the sources I've provided for you, or from external sources that you've gotten yourself. So you will be seeing that question. It's going to be very general. It's nothing too specific. And that just needs to be turned into me anytime before the end of the semester. And by the end of the semester, I mean the last day of classes, so that I have that week to grade them before I have to grade your finals. So it would be due on essentially what we often call Dead Day, which I don't remember what day that is this year, what the date is, but it's the Friday that we all take off to study, supposedly, for our finals that start Saturday morning. So on that day, I need to have that short essay. The second thing that I would like to have, and I believe I put a deadline of November 30th on this, which gives you a little over 2 weeks, actually. And what I want from you on that is an annotated bibliography. An annotated bibliography simply is a bibliography like you would normally do for a reference page in a paper that you're writing. It's APA style. You only need to do 2 external sources. And what you do with an annotated bibliography is you cite it according to APA style, and then you put a couple of paragraphs below that explains what that source tells us. For you all, I would like 2 paragraphs per article that you cite, or book, or whatever you choose to cite. The first paragraph is going to be a summary of the article, not just the abstract of the article, but an actual summary of the article that we can understand. The second paragraph is going to be where you explain to us why that particular article or book or reference is useful to us as political communication scholars. So that is not necessarily a difficult assignment, and it shouldn't take you too long. Again, another short assignment, 2 external sources. They must be peer reviewed, which means that they should be a journal article, a book, a scholastic book, not a textbook that, I might assign you in class to, that gives you a summary of everything, but instead a book that maybe explains a theory, or if you don't want to do an entire book, a book chapter, for example, that might be particularly informative to you. Anything around political communication, anything you're interested in political communication. The only catch is that it cannot be a source that I have provided to you already. The third thing that is a big assignment, not a big assignment, but not a tiny assignment, not a, it's sort of medium, I guess, with the other two, is the explication assignment. And the more I've gone through the explication assignment in my head, the more I realized I don't think it's going to work for this semester. So we're going to do something a little bit different. And I don't know what that is yet, but we will make up for those points a different way. And again, it won't be a major assignment or anything like that that requires a whole lot of time on your part, because your time is limited and so is mine, of course, and that's totally acceptable and okay. So the main assignments you have coming up are your final exam, which is during finals week, your short essay, which I have to give you the question for, and your annotated bibliography. Now, the annotated bibliography you can post to the discussion board. I believe I've already put up that discussion board for you. So all you have to do is just put it right up there, whether you copy and paste it, attach a file, whichever way you want to do it. The idea is that we're all going to be able to see what you sort of tell us we should study, or think articles we might want to look at that are interesting, that you found particularly helpful, perhaps. I also put up a discussion board with a question for you. It was about the midterms, very general. I would like that by I have a date put on it. I gave you a full week to do it from the day that I put it up. So hopefully that has not been a problem for you. The midterm election results are still coming in, which is fascinating and sort of reassuring in a way. I kind of like that we've gotten away from predicting election results very, very early. People took those as actual results when all they were predictions. So what we really need to do is accept that when, that it takes time and effort to count ballots, to count votes, to ensure that the votes get counted. I think we've been sort of haberdashing it. Haberdashing, that's not the right word. That's a shoemaker, I believe. I think we've been sort of putting together a mishmash of ways of counting, ways of predicting, statistical analysis, all sorts of statistical models that we've been using. And that's great for predicting. That doesn't tell you the actual vote count. And so people have been demanding, I must know who the president is on the day of on election day. That's not possible, really. And we see the kind of trouble that we can get into with the 2020 election when we decide that it has to be that night, that you call the election at whatever time that day that you can call it. And that's just not the way our system works. It never has worked that way. It might seem like we've always worked on a I need to know now sort of basis with political elections and results. But the truth of the matter is that in 2000, it took well over 2 weeks for us to find out who the president was. That in the past, it obviously took a lot longer. And so, it's great that we have these machines that count and everything, but we do need to ensure some semblance of safety and ensuring that the votes get counted properly, which is why we're seeing recounts occur, which is why we're seeing runoff elections occur, like in Georgia with Warnock and with Herschel Walker. So those kinds of things are important to our democracy, because when there's a really a very fine difference between who's getting elected, is between two people like that, it's really important that we go back and actually find out what people want, who they want to represent them, who they want elected. It's looking like something very unique is going to happen, something that hasn't happened in a very long time. I started voting in the 1992 elections, and in 1994, Bill Clinton and the Democrats got their butt spanked. I don't know how else to put that, in the midterm elections. And I expect that now, because it was my first election that I voted in. I expect that the midterms are going to turn into an absolute disaster for whichever party's in power. This was true with Barack Obama. This was true with Bill Clinton. It was true with both of the Bushes, actually. So it's something that we're sort of adapted to. The predictions would be that the Democrats should have been crushed in the midterms. And that's why they start talking about a red wave or a red tsunami, or in times when we have a Republican president, or we might hear a blue wave or a blue tsunami. They like to use those references a lot, which of course makes no sense, because very rarely does the American polity elect people that way. Landslide elections are the exception to the rule rather than the rule itself. And how does that happen, and why does that happen, and where does the divisiveness come from? Well, the answer to that is in last week's topic, which is political advertising. Now, some of you might have thought, well, we've studied political advertising. We know what political ads look like. Nobody likes them. They're terrible. You end up in mudslinging, and that is actually generally true. However, another thing that is true and has not changed is that negative ads are the ads that people remember, that they pay the most attention to, and that they want. Even though we all say we don't like negative advertising, those are the ones that we respond to the most. And that has been really, really problematic at times if you want to maintain, hey, we need to keep our democracy going. And there's this, at the same time, huge gap between two parties. And the mushy middle gets squished even further. And that increases the amount of divisiveness that we have. Positive ads versus negative ads, it has always been the same. There's no such thing as a neutral ad, unfortunately. One would think with third-person sponsors. For example, when the NRA sponsors an ad, or the ACLU, or a certain PAC, when they sponsor ads, they have to say that they are sponsoring the ad, not the candidates. And when we started doing that, you would have thought that would have led to more neutral ads. But that's actually when the attacks get worse. So positive ads and maybe slightly negative attack ads come from the parties themselves and from the campaigns. But truly, like sort of mudslinging, as we call it, advertising, negative advertising in politics usually comes from a third person entity. Again, be that a PAC or an institution of some kind that donates money to campaigns and might even produce an ad or two for a campaign, be that on social media, radio, television. So generally, advertising has fallen into those two categories, positive and negative. Great. That doesn't tell us a whole heck of a lot, except that there's a lot of negative advertising, particularly in the 1980s. If you go back to, I believe it was the 84 election. I always have to double check myself on this one, but I believe it was the 84 election when there was a massive amount of mud being slung back and forth between the candidates. And the cover of Newsweek was just a political cartoon with mudslinging going back and forth between the candidates, and these caricatures of the candidates, if you will. And that was really rough to get through. And people were like, oh, politics is just dirty. It's a terrible thing. We shouldn't be paying attention to it, right? But over the past 40 years, we've learned that it's probably important to pay attention to what's going on in politics, because not because politics is important to us, not because we care who's in power in the presidency necessarily, or even which party's in power. What we want to do is we want to actually dig into the issues. And believe it or not, people respond to issues a lot better than they respond to a candidate. It's almost like they know that there is a distinction between who gets elected and what policies get passed. So the American polity is not stupid. They're actually quite smart. And they've always have been until about 2015 to 2016, when we started to see that J.D. Vance's book, which I think is a great book, by the way. I'm not sure what's happened to JD in the time between when his book was released and now, but his book was a really good observation on the reliance on thinking that the American public, the voters, were stupid, and preying on that and utilizing that as a strategy. And it's unfortunate that we saw that come to pass very, very distinctly It was in neon, Technicolor, if you will. The signs that said, "Hey, we're going to start to treat academics like they're terrible people. They're a bunch of elitists. We're going to treat politicians like they're a bunch of elitists. We're going to talk about people who are poor and uneducated and sort of celebrate those people in the hopes that we would be able to sort of sway them to vote for a certain political party, which in that case would have been the Republican Party." By the way, this is not a party, really a party affiliate argument. There have been times where the Democrats have played a similar game. And both sides have been playing this game for a long time. The difference has been in the past 20 to 30 years, or I'm sorry, 20 to 30, that would be a lot. In the past 10 years or so with political elections, the difference has been social media. So what I want to talk about is how we studied political ads, aside from just the positive versus negative ads, how we studied them in the past. And the reason I say in the past is because there are two very dominant theories about political advertisements during the heyday of the 80s, 90s, and early aughts, where those two theories were sort of competing with each other to see which one best explained political advertisements to us. And at that time, we didn't have to go any further than television advertising and radio advertising and perhaps some buttons, if you want. Political buttons, I think, were studied by Benoit and his crew when I was at Mizzou. That was when I was at Mizzou. So that would have been the early aughts, so 2000 and 2004. So what were those two approaches? The first one comes from someone called Linda Cade, Lynda, Linda Cade, Kaid. And she did a lot of work with a theory that she developed called video style. Okay. And video style really sort of outlined how candidates appeared on television and what impact that had on a political ad and how it would be received. She really focused on sort of mostly the image of the candidate, rather than the issues of the candidate. And at the time, this was a common way of looking at political ads, was to look at, well, what are the image optics that we're getting out of this, rather than what's the substance of the issues that they're talking about. On the other side of that debate was a work by William Benoit, Benoit. And Bill Benoit wrote something called the functional approach to political advertising. And he actually went back to, it was way back that he went in time to look at the history of political ads. And I really like his methodology there. But ultimately, what he did was he said there are two main things that ads do. They attack or they acclaim. And sometimes there's a third category that I think over the 20 or 30 years that theory was used a lot, sort of became disproven, which was defense. So you had in the functional approach, three kinds of ads. They attacked, they acclaimed, or they defended. So let's just get rid of that defended one for a minute, because the truth is that there were so few ads that fell into the defense category that he basically threw those out. They weren't worth looking at. What was worth looking at was attacking and defending, depending on what the ad was attacking or defending. Was the ad attacking the character of the politician, of the candidate? Or was it attacking the issues that the campaign was running on? If it was attacking image, what did it attack? If it was attacking issues, what did it attack? Was it about the content or about the end policy or about the process? So he had these sort of truly fairly detailed categories that we would throw ads into. And what we wanted to know is what were the most common types of advertising, and what did those tell us? So these really have an issue focus rather than an image focus in a lot of ways, because most of the advertisements we ended up looking at were attacks or claims on issues. And of those two, the greatest number was attacks. In other words, the functional approach and also the video style approach, those both prove the theory that negative advertising works better than positive advertising. Now, I say that those two, I talk about them in the past, partly because I worked under both of them. I worked under Linda Cade at the University of Oklahoma. I worked under Bill Benoit at the University of Missouri. In other words, I studied under them. I was taught by them, and they both have a really good idea of how to look at political advertisements, particularly on television. However, my students, as I've been teaching here at Missouri State, my master's students have tried to apply the functional approach to social media, and they can't. And video style doesn't work because there's not always an image with it, and there's not always a video. So how do we go about studying the advertisements on social media? That became a huge question. And I don't know if you figured this out yet based on what you've been reading, but we don't have a general theory of how to look at social media political advertisement yet. We have not gotten our brains around it yet. And in absolute honesty, when I was working under Bill and under Linda both, when I was studying under them, they had probably 20 years worth of research in at that point, and now it would be up to 30. And then Linda moved on and Bill moved on. They retired, and there's no way to pick up the mantle of their research because it's not applicable as much as television advertising was. Now, we still use television advertising, but it is not necessarily the only way that we get the message out. And so in order to understand how the polity looks at political ads and how that helps them or doesn't help them make a decision, in order to do that, we need to find new ways to study them. You'll still see every now and then an article that uses the functional approach or that looks at video style. But it's more rare now than it used to be, and I'm not sure how helpful it is to actually learn those theories inside and out. I used to have you all do a project where we looked at political ads from both of those approaches, and I would teach you the theory and how to test it, and we could do a study if we wanted to. But nowadays, they just don't seem to answer any questions like they used to. And so we're finding new ways, I think, to talk about political advertisements. I personally worked on a study with Charlton McElwain and I can't remember our third party's name. That is terrible. One would think I could remember that. But we wrote a couple of chapters looking at how people responded in the moment to race issues in campaigns. And that was a really interesting study because Charlton's in New York City. My friend's in Chicago. My other friend is in Chicago, Stephen Caliendo. There it is. Stephen Caliendo's in Chicago. And I'm, of course, down here in Springfield, Missouri. And we did most of our studies down here. And so they were really just shocked at some of the results that we got. But the book that we published in absolutely loved it because we were getting a very different part of the polity than they were getting in the big urban areas. And so we had a lot of really good data to work with. But that was very specifically geared towards studying race in politics. The other thing that I wanted to talk to you about besides political advertising, though, and political speeches, which are pretty general, to be honest with you, speeches have not changed. They are pretty much the same throughout decades, okay? They are expected to do the same thing that they do, and that's that. So I let you read an article about that, but What I'm really interested in sometimes is the gender differences in how politicians talk. So you have a candidate who is a male versus a candidate who is a female. Now, when I say male and female, I'm not talking about masculine and feminine. I'm talking about literally the differences in how they identify. And the reason that I'm talking about that is because there's a lot of confusion about why a man is better at the job of being a politician than a woman, or vice versa, a woman is better than a man. And of course, we're just now getting into a world where transgender candidates are accepted and elected. And I think that's really going to throw a wrench into the system a little bit, except for this. Men and women, or however anybody identifies, can actually use masculine, quote unquote, masculine communication traits or quote unquote feminine communication traits. And I think that's where the differences are going to come in. I am a very masculine communicator, if we want to look at it that way. Hillary Clinton's a masculine communicator, whereas a lot of others are feminine in style. For example, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, very feminine in style. What do I mean by that? Well, that leads us into studies done by Carlin Coors Campbell. That's Campbell, just like our main street. Carlin Coors Campbell wanted to look at women in politics specifically. She was came up just after suffrage into the second wave of feminism. And she really writes a lot of works that sort of trace how we were developing as a country, honestly. In all of her works. She's been writing for over 50 years, I think. At this point, I've sort of lost track. She's very old, but very, very smart still, and sharp as a whip, and she just produces literature all the time. Studies, commentaries, theoretical perspectives, you name it, she's done it. She's one of our leaders in political communication, not just for women, but for women and men in all of political communication. She's well respected as a scholar. She developed something called the feminine style. And the feminine style, when we adopt the feminine style, is maybe what you're thinking. The feminine style has basically four or five parts. Let me go through them, and then I'll remember. First of all, instead of using the words I or me, we use the words we, okay? So we use the plural nouns and the inclusive nouns, which leads to the second thing that the feminine style includes, which is inclusive language, generally speaking. And that leads to the third, which is an invitational rhetoric. That is, we actually want the audience to participate with us as we speak. So instead of us talking down to them in some way and saying, this is how it is, instead we open that up to being responsive to the audience. And then the next one is that we do talk about women's health issues and issues that, quote unquote, women have. That used to mean all domestic issues, such as the price of groceries. Sometimes, very rarely, the price of gas, but the price of groceries, how they're going to pay for their school, for their kids' clothing, how they're going to pay for their kids' schooling. All of those were considered feminine or female issues because the woman took care of those things. I'm not saying this isn't really stereotypical, but that is our history. So we sort of have to weave that in here. Now, that does not mean that men cannot utilize parts of or the whole of feminine style. If they adopt the feminine style, men or women, I don't do the feminine style very well. I'm going to be honest. I mean, I'm terrible at it. President Obama, amazing at it. Really, really good at it, actually. I'm terrible. So there are times when I can really identify the feminine style in a presidential speech. But the problem is, or in a congressional speech, in any political speech, the problem is we don't know whether that's good or bad. We don't know. I mean, to say that someone uses the feminine style, is that okay? Is that good? Is that bad? How does that impact the audience? And what it comes down to is it depends on the context of the speech. It depends on the rhetorical situation, which, again, not surprising. And that doesn't tell us a whole lot about the success of speeches, whether they're going to be successful, whether they have been successful. So when we look at political advertisements and we look at political speeches, we're sort of looking for the same things. What is the argument that that candidate is making, and how do they utilize that argument? Is it an attack on their opponent, on the opponent's character, on the opponent's issues? Is it an acclaim of their own character, their own policy issues? Are they defensive in posture because somebody has attacked them in some way and they want to respond? What style of communication do they use? Do they adopt a feminine style, a certain video style? Are they particularly, are they choosy in whether they use the high, common, or middle level of style? What is it that they do there? So in other words, the 5 canons of rhetoric, if you've heard of them yet, which I imagine most of you have at least heard of them, invention, arrangement, style, memory, and delivery. I had to think for a second. Those 5 tenets, those 5 canons, those 5 rules of rhetoric are what we're still studying. We're just studying them in specific contexts and in specific ways. But overall, the 5 tenets or the 5 canons that Cicero outlined for us that are based on Aristotle's work, that's still how we look at political speech, which is pretty amazing if you ask me. So the discussion that I asked you to address this week is whether or not you followed a particular midterm election. I wanted to know which one you were paying attention to the most. I of course I was very favorable, I guess, towards looking at the Fetterman-Oz race in Pennsylvania. You guys know that. But now I'm watching the Boebert race. I'm watching the Kelly race, which I think just got decided. I'm watching the gubernatorial race in Arizona. I am focused on all of those now. Not because I have a particular party that I'm just absolutely rooting for, but there are candidates that I absolutely root for, right? And it's okay to admit that. But they're also interesting in studying them. There are several things that go into my understanding of political communication when I study during an election season. The first is, who is the candidate, or who are the candidates? What do they talk about? What is their interest? So it's sort of the what and the who. Then I get really into what their strategies are. What the messaging strategies are. Are they attacking? Are they defending? Are they acclaiming their own work? What strategies are they utilizing? The third thing that I look at is the audience. What is the audience looking for from their candidates in that particular situation? One of the things that always bothered me in 2016 was that President Trump and his team, including everybody who went and spoke as surrogates for President Trump, talked about bringing back the steel mills in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in Erie, and in Bethlehem, in the parts of the state that are well known or were well known for steel. That was, to me, a ridiculous argument. How could you possibly say that we're going to bring back the steel industry to Western Pennsylvania when the steel industry literally is over in China now? All of it. And there's no more coke or iron or chromium left in the ground in Western Pennsylvania for us to make steel with. There were a lot of flaws in that argument. However, it was a great strategy because the people of Western Pennsylvania have been in such a depression, economically speaking, that they would love to have the steel mills back. And so if you just say, I'm going to bring back steel mills, you're going to get a response from that audience that's very positive. And so it's a good strategy unless you try to look at the actual practicalities of the policy. And most of the time when candidates are running, whether they're from any party, doesn't matter when it is, they're trying to win. And so a winning strategy is what they're looking for, obviously. The next thing that I look at is always election night, of course, to sit there going, let's watch the returns come in. That's always exciting to me. I'm a big Steve Kornacki fan. If you know who that is, I watch the website for 538 with Nate Silver. I love watching that stuff. I love digging into it. I can't do statistics to save my life, but I do know what the numbers mean. And so that's kind of a cool thing to watch. But then the fun part comes when they start talking about exit polls, quote unquote, exit polls. What are exit polls? That's when literally they come up to you after you voted and say, who did you vote for? What did you think about that? What did you think about so-and-so's strategy to win? Do you think that's going to work for them? And you can answer however you like, of course, because, our votes are still private. Most people have forgotten that the vote for Americans is a private vote. You are not to be pressured into voting for one person or another. So it's a private vote, which means that your answer can be anything you want your answer to be. And sometimes these exit polls come out and they're funny to me. They're humorous because I realize there's just no way that's even remotely accurate, right? There have only been a few times when I've been surprised that the exit polls matched the outcome. And that was when there was a wrestler, and I can't think of his name, but he became the governor of Minnesota for a while. It was the worst time in Minnesota history from what I understand, but everybody thought it was funny to vote for this guy, thinking there's no way he would ever win, and then he did. That was a really humorous moment for me because at the time I was not living in Minnesota, so I could be like, "Oh, good luck with that, guys. Have a good time up there." I can't believe I've forgotten that guy's name, but he was known as the Body. And then when he became a part of the government, he started going by the name the Mind. So when I figure out who that was, you all probably are like, what are you talking about? This was 20 years ago in Minnesota, which, who's paying attention to that? The history of Minnesota is not on the agenda for most of us when we're having a casual light conversation or even when we're studying history. And so the political communication that comes not just from the candidates and the campaigns down, but from the voters up is fascinating to me. That's the stuff I like. I like looking at how voters try to communicate, citizens try to communicate with their government. And what's the intervening variable there? The media. Now, I hate it when we say the media because that's just improper grammar. So let's just start there. You're supposed to just say media when media intervene because they have to. And their job is sort of to summarize everything that they're hearing. And yes, there's always going to be a bias or a bent on that. Yes, there's always going to be a leaning one way or the other. Yes, there's always going to be things that they focus on rather than something else. That is always true. And that's true for a newspaper article as much as it is for national TV media personalities. So what do we do with that? Well, part of our job as communication scholars is to actually study that as well, to look at it for the accuracy, look at it for the representation of the people, look at it for how well, honestly, they predict things. And how that guides the vote of the country. So I've given you a lot to think about in this lecture, and I'm glad that somebody told me that you did not have it because I kept referencing it, like I said, but now you have it. And if you have any questions or anything, of course, text me, call me. You can email me. But again, remember, I'm having surgery on Monday, so my eyesight not stellar. Okay, but, that is another way to get a hold of me. And then, of course, on Blackboard in the discussion posts. So I hope you all have a good weekend. And I hope that next week goes very smoothly for you and for me, to be honest with you. And we'll work through it until I can actually be able to present myself to you again on video. Thanks, everybody. We'll talk to you soon.